Britain accounts for less than 0.2% of arms exports in the world to Israel. And this is affecting 0.1%. Sorry, well, this is affecting less than 10%
Yeah.
of that,
Yes.
less than 0.2%. That's not, it upsets people in Israel, but it isn't going to change their policy in any way. It is the United States who is really influential in changing Israeli policy. They are shifting heaven and earth at the moment to try to do that. And this is a really crucial few days coming up for any hope of a ceasefire, which is long overdue in Gaza. And it really is time that both Hamas and Israel agreed to that. But both of them have been very difficult over it. You need to influence Hamas as well as Israel.
William Hague, if you were Foreign Secretary, would you be doing this to Israel?
No, I certainly don't think so. I haven't, of course, seen all the legal advice that the ministers have received, and it is very tricky, the area of legal advice on arms export controls, which ministers have. They must uphold the law, and you can get very tricky and often contradictory advice. But my political instinct on this, if I was making a decision, would be that this is neither here nor there, this decision. The ministers are saying to the Israelis, don't worry, we're not doing anything really here. It won't affect your security. We're only revoking 30 out of 350 licenses. You won't really notice it. And then they're saying to other people who pressed for a more radical embargo on sales to Israel. Oh, we are taking action. Yes, this shows our disapproval of some of the things that Israel is doing. And the result will be they'll please neither side and just be continually caught in the argument about this. The oddity here is that we are a country that helps to defend Israel rightly. When the Iranians launched that wave of missiles, some weeks ago against Israel, the RAF took part in shooting them down. That was the right thing to do. I'm sure that would be done again under the new government if that happened again. How odd it is to actually engage in defending a country and then say, well, we're also revoking some of your export licenses. I think that's a strange position to be in.
But would they say, well, we're trying to help shape Israeli policy in some way in terms of how they conduct themselves in the theatre of war?
It won't shape Israeli policy. And remember that Britain accounts for less than 0.2% of arms exports in the world to Israel. And this is affecting 0.1%. Sorry, well, this is affecting less than 10% of that.
Yes.
Less than 0.2%. That's not, it upsets people in Israel, but it isn't going to change their policy in any way. It is the United States who is really influential in changing Israeli policy. They are shifting heaven and earth at the moment to try to do that. And this is a really crucial few days coming up for any hope of a ceasefire, which is long overdue in Gaza. And it really is time that both Hamas and Israel agreed to that. But both of them have been very difficult over it. You need to influence Hamas as well as Israel.
Is this virtue signaling, Kezia, in your view, or is this following the rule of law?
I think it's very clear from the comments you heard there from John Healey that the Labour government feels a huge sense of responsibility to ensure that component parts that are made in factories in Britain are not used in any acts of war crimes. And the judgment that they've made is it's possible that some of these items that are made, 30 out of the 350 licenses might, and the legal advice is they should no longer export them to Israel. I think when you introduce politics to this, it gets a bit more complicated than that. But what I heard from the Labour spokesperson or the Labour minister there was a clear sense that they're just following the detail of the law. And when it comes to the politics, and I listen to what the Conservatives are saying about this, you've got Robert Jenrick on one hand saying this is gesture politics and Boris Johnson on the other saying it's a complete abandonment. So I think that just proves the point that politics is completely misplaced here.
The question I asked John Healey, which he wasn't really able to answer, was about Saudi Arabia. Because if you're going to have an ethical arms policy, if an ethical arms policy is indeed possible at all, let's pretend for a moment it is, you have to be careful of every single weapon or component of weapon you send out that it's used to proper and non-illegal effect. That won't be true of Saudi Arabia, bearing in mind its conduct in the war in Yemen. yet they're willing to stop selling weapons to Israel, but they're not willing to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. If you're going to have this ethical policy, don't you have to do it across the board?
I agree, Stig, and perhaps we'll see more of that now.
But they've not done that. They're not saying we are absolutely changing our position on the arms industry. They've picked 35 out of 350 Israeli things. They're not re-examining their relationship with Saudi Arabia. They're not going further with Israel. It just seems they're trying to please everybody here. And therefore, it's not an ethical decision. It is a political decision.
I disagree with that completely, because you've just made it a political public policy choice there about the position you take on arms exports in the round. What I think John Healey's done here is said, this is the law and we're applying it to this set of circumstances and it tells us this and we're acting on that basis. It's that logic I would expect to be applied to all examples.
Do you think, William, they'll be willing, or is it right to apply it to Saudi Arabia? We sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. They commit war crimes in Yemen. That seems to be fairly straightforward statement on both sides, and yet we're not going to do anything to stop that.
Well, they won't. No, they are not going to suspend any arms sales to Saudi Arabia. By the way, Saudi Arabia is not currently engaged in a war in Yemen. It was, of course, and that there were very controversial incidents in that. But Saudi Arabia at the moment is trying to stay out of events in Yemen. So I think it would be hard to sustain the case that Saudi Arabia is the same. Nevertheless, I agree with your point that there's a political judgment here. And I would say that to Kezia. Yes, you get this strong legal advice as a foreign secretary. I've had this many times when I was in office on arms exports. But in the end, there's some degree of political judgment about it. And there's meant to be, because this is about global affairs and international relations. And there's a reason we have ministers in charge of that, not lawyers in charge of it, who could just make an entirely legal decision. There is a political judgment about how to interpret the legal advice.
So Lammy could have been given advice that said these 35 are a bit suspect and said, actually, I'm not going to take that advice and suspend them.
Well, in the majority of cases of legal advice, yeah, there is some leeway. That's all. I haven't seen the legal advice that he's received, so I don't want to condemn him unfairly. But usually that legal advice allows some leeway. It says, well, it will say, well, your options here are to suspend 30 or to suspend 100, or maybe not to suspend any, but take the flak for that. It's very rare you get a submission from the civil service that doesn't give you 3 options to choose from, even though it suggests choosing the middle one, whatever that is.
Oh, that is a great insight. Now, listen, it's a big week for the Conservative leadership race, the biggest since the last one. Official campaign launches are happening right, a bit further right, and a bit more centre. When the chosen one takes the front opposition bench, they'll be facing 404 Labour MPs, and over the next 4.5 years, we'll have to get the country and their own party to believe in them again. William Hague has got some tips for them in his column this morning. It's a kind of similar scenario to that which you faced, similar numbers anyway, but the point you're making in your column is that that Labour government enjoyed some popularity, and this one, probably, because of the circumstances and also because of the very gloomy outlook that's coming down the line, they are not. So what are the lessons in all of this for the Conservatives, William?
Well, yes, it's that situation that looks very similar, this huge Labour majority, to when Tony Blair came in 1997. But it's not. The circumstances are different of the country and the world. The government starts out being much less popular. So I'm saying in my article in the Times today, now be careful on the Conservative side, because this can lead you into mistakes. This can lead you to say everything that they do, well, we're going to reverse it. But then you might regret saying that in 4 or 5 years' time at the next election. You don't know what the circumstances are going to be. It might lead you into thinking, because the Labour government might become is becoming unpopular very quickly, that the Conservative Party doesn't need to change as much as you might have thought. But it does need to change. And Labour will become unpopular, but the Conservatives could be unpopular at the same time. And the Conservatives cannot be a party just for older people. It will be vital for a revitalized Conservative Party to appeal to new generations and to people and to moderate voters and people are nearer to the center of politics. So don't underestimate the change that is necessary. These are 2 key parts of my advice to all these. leadership contender today.
And it's interesting that you say don't oppose everything. So what perhaps should they, what that's been announced so far, should they maybe get on board with a bit more?
Well, it depends what happens, of course, next, but the government will do some things that it's not that you don't want to oppose. An example from my own time was the minimum wage, right? Conservatives have always been against introducing minimum wage. Tony Blair introduced it. Well, I decided, well, we're not going to oppose it anymore. We're just going to let that come in. And indeed, after that, Conservative, when we came back into power, we were quite aggressive about increasing the minimum wage. We changed our view. We moved on with the times. Now, an example might be the government is clearly aiming to improve relations with the EU in some ways, to have a more fixed sort of defense and foreign policy cooperation with the EU. Well, if they do that in a way that doesn't constrain the freedom of action of the United Kingdom, it won't be worth trying to get rid of it again in the future. It won't be popular to try to get rid of it. But Conservatives might be tempted to say, oh no, that's going back on Brexit. We're going to get rid of that. So that and many other things will be temptations that need to be resisted by the new leader of the opposition, whoever that is.